you think of Hollywood, what do you see? Spotlights cutting through the California haze, movie stars strutting down a red carpet, a giant white sign perched on a hill watching over the city of broken dreams and golden ones too. But what if I told you that the man who built Hollywood never cared for movies at all? That behind the land of celluloid fantasy lies the accidental legacy of a quiet, limping real estate developer from the Midwest? Tonight, on Face of History, we travel back to the dusty roads and orange groves of 19th century Los Angeles to meet Harvey Henderson Wilcox, the man who didn't invent the movies, but gave them the world's biggest stage. I'm the Duke of New York. Let's fade in. To understand Hollywood's accidental father, you have to start far from the palm trees and searchlights. You have to stand barefoot in the muddy lanes of Wayne County, Ohio, sometime in the 1830s, where the world was small, but the sky felt impossibly big. Harvey Henderson Wilcox was born on a cold day in 1832, the third child of John and Sarah Wilcox. They were settlers of sturdy, unremarkable stock, the kind of people history usually forgets. They didn't write books or win battles. They raised children, mended fences, and read scripture by candlelight. Their farm sat on the edge of civilization. Ohio back then was America's near western frontier. All rolling farmland, thick woods, muddy roads that turned to impassable rivers come spring thaw. If you wanted to survive here, you didn't just work hard. You worked constantly. From the moment you could stand, you were hauling water, chopping wood, feeding chickens, stitching clothes, learning how to wrestle a living out of the stubborn earth. For little Harvey, life was equal parts toil and tenderness. His mother, Sarah, was the gentle glue, a quiet woman with rough hands and a warm lap who taught him his letters beside the hearth. His father, John, was sterner, a leather worker and farmer, up before dawn, boots slick with morning mud. By age 6, Harvey was already pushing a plow behind the bigger boys, carrying buckets nearly half his weight. At night, when his brothers lay exhausted on straw pallets, Harvey lingered awake, wide-eyed, staring at the rafters, dreaming of something more than fields and fences. He was never the biggest. He was never the fastest. But even then, folks said Harvey had a mind like a steel trap, curious, careful, full of quiet questions no one else bothered to ask. But life, as it often does, had other plans. When Harvey was 13, the sickness came. They didn't call it polio then. They called it the infantile paralysis, a shadow that crept into small farmhouses and left children forever changed. One morning, Harvey couldn't stand. His legs ached, his back curled in pain. By sundown, the boy who once ran barefoot through pasture grass was bedbound, staring at the same rafters, now wishing for nothing but to stand again. There was no cure, no doctor's bag of miracles, just prayers, poultices, and time. When he finally rose, weeks later, the limp was there to stay. One leg dragged slightly behind the other. The strong boy who'd wrestled pigs and helped mend fences could no longer keep pace with his brothers in the fields. But where his legs failed, his mind found new footing. Confined indoors more than out, Harvey turned to books. Neighbors said it was the local preacher who first noticed, bringing over old sermons, battered law books, even a few precious newspapers from the East. In those ink-smudged pages, Harvey learned there was more to the world than cornrows and cider presses. He read about land deeds, town charters, laws, and loopholes, entire cities born from paper and signatures. He saw that owning land, not working it, was where real power hid. He began helping his father with accounts. He kept ledgers for neighbors, drew up tiny contracts in the margins of scrap paper. When he hobbled into the village post office to collect mail, he lingered there for hours, reading notices, court summons, land auctions pinned to the walls. It's easy now, with hindsight, to see the shape of the man forming. Harvey Wilcox, the boy with the limp who chose maps over plows, parchment over pitchforks. Of course, none of this looked heroic then. To the other farm boys, he was just the Wilcox kid who limped, the one who'd never matched them in the fields or the barnyard brawls. But Harvey didn't care. He knew that in America, even on the muddy lanes of rural Ohio, land was the one language everyone respected, and he intended to speak it fluently. He was 15 when he left the farm to clerk at the county courthouse, the first Wilcox to swap soil for ink. By night, he studied law by oil lamp. By day, he copied deeds and contracts until the words danced behind his eyes. Out there, somewhere past the horizon, was a country on the move, new towns sprouting like weeds, railroads clawing westward, fortunes stashed in the cracks of every acre. A boy in Ohio could dream, even with a limp, even with dirt under his nails. And Harvey did. Soundscape, faint sound of a steam locomotive whistle, as if distant thunder is calling. He couldn't run, so he'd find another way to get where he was going. Next stop, Kansas. And then, further still, to the dusty hills of California, where a name and a dream would make history, without him ever knowing. Stay with me, because next we'll follow young Harvey West to boomtowns, heartbreak, and the seed of an idea called Hollywood. America in the mid-1800s was a country that refused to stand still, a place where dirt roads turned to iron rails overnight, where the promise of land, free, vast, waiting, crackled like wildfire in every young man's chest. And Harvey Henderson Wilcox, once a limping farm boy from Wayne County, Ohio, was about to stake his claim. It started with a ticket, one way, westward to Kansas. He was just 20 when he packed what little he owned into a battered leather satchel. A few shirts, a good coat, a stack of law papers tied with twine, and the quiet certainty that whatever waited out there, he'd find a way to own it. Kansas in the 1850s wasn't for the faint of heart. It was raw. A frontier drawn in rough timber and the clash of settlers and native tribes. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had turned the plains into a battleground. Bleeding Kansas, they called it, as abolitionists and slaveholders fought to plant flags in virgin soil. But Harvey wasn't looking to fight. He was looking to build. Sound, a creaking wagon, boots crunching dry prairie grass. He settled first near Topeka, a muddy stopover trying to become a city. He worked as a clerk in the county courthouse, a young man with ink-stained sleeves and a mind that never stopped turning. He watched land disputes come and go, ranchers fencing off open range, railroad men carving up homesteads, speculators buying whole sections for pennies and flipping them for fortunes. Here, Harvey learned the real frontier wasn't the grassland. It was the courthouse steps. It was the scrap of paper that said, "This land is mine," and the will to hold it when someone else came to take it. By 1861, Kansas joined the Union, free soil, free men. And Harvey Wilcox, no soldier, no gunslinger, made himself useful in 1,000 small ways, writing deeds, settling boundary arguments, drafting contracts no one else understood. He gained a reputation as a fair dealer, a man who didn't speak more than he needed to, but didn't miss a single detail. It was there, too, that he found love. His first wife, Ellen Benner, she was the daughter of another settler family, born under the same hard skies. She had quick eyes and a voice that could hush any storm. They married in a plain clapboard church, barely bigger than a barn. For a while, life steadied. Harvey built up a modest practice. He bought small plots, fenced them, sold them, a mule here, a wagon there. He never got rich, but in the churn of Kansas boomtowns, staying honest was a wealth of its own. But frontier life has teeth. A low wind picks up, a door slams, distant thunder rolls in. Ellen fell ill, fever, then pneumonia. Medicine was more prayer than cure in those days. Harvey sat beside her bed for days and nights that blurred together. By the time the thaw came, she was gone, buried under a rough wooden cross on borrowed land. Some men would have folded, gone home, buried themselves under routine or drink or worse. But Harvey did what he always did. He kept moving. In the 1870s, the railroad was the true kingmaker. Rails spread like veins across the continent. And Harvey Wilcox, the quiet lawyer with a limp, understood that whoever owned land along the rails owned the future. He shifted from lawyer to developer, sketching out town sites near new rail junctions, buying up dusty acres before the tracks arrived, betting that when they did, the small squares on his maps would blossom into bustling towns. Some did, some didn't. But Harvey had learned patience back on the farm, and Kansas rewarded the patient and the shrewd. By the early 1880s, Harvey was known not just as a lawyer, but as a man who could sniff out opportunity buried in prairie dust. He'd grown older, sterner, more private, a man who still limped, still kept careful ledgers, still walked the muddy streets while others drank away their winnings in noisy saloons. Then, as fate would have it, came Deida. Sound, a piano plays softly like parlor music in a distant room. She was 20 years younger, bright, curious, artistic. She'd grown up in Hicksville, Ohio, a name that might have made lesser dreamers ashamed but made Deida laugh. She wanted more than a small town. She wanted ideas. She met Harvey through church circles. The rumor is she admired his moral certainty, his steady ways, his reputation as an honest man in a time when land deals were anything but. To Harvey, Deida was a second chance, a reason to risk opening his guarded heart again. They married in 1883. Neighbors said the old lawyer looked younger by 10 years when Deida was at his side. She saw things he couldn't or wouldn't. Together they packed up what they'd built in Kansas. Harvey was 51. Not exactly a young pioneer, but the promise of a new frontier whispered louder than comfort. This time they pointed their compass as far west as the rails would carry them, to Los Angeles. A sleepy outpost then, orange groves, vineyards, sunlit hills, a city dreaming of itself. Sound the train whistle screams, replaced by distant birds and soft wind through citrus trees. In 1884, the Wilcoxes stepped off the train and into a city waiting to be born. Los Angeles was a handful of streets, Spanish mission bells, and rumors of something bigger. Land was cheap, if you were quick. And Harvey, now seasoned by Kansas courts and prairie storms, knew exactly what to do with cheap land and an empty map. He bought acres southwest of downtown. He drew neat plots on parchment. He laid out streets, water pipes, promises of quiet neighborhoods for sober, hardworking families. It was practical, predictable, safe. But the story of Hollywood would need one last spark, a dream bigger than Harvey's tidy ledgers. And that spark was Deida, who would turn her husband's sleepy ranch into the world's most famous neighborhood with nothing more than a name. It's funny how history sometimes turns on the smallest hinge. A word overheard, a stranger met in passing, an idle conversation that sparks a chain of events bigger than the people in it. And so it was with Hollywood, a name that slipped into the world almost by accident, in the plush seats of a rumbling train. It was sometime around 1886. Harvey Henderson Wilcox was back in Kansas on business, tying up old deeds, finalizing land deals that still needed his signature. Meanwhile, his wife, Deida, young, curious, a little restless, boarded a train heading east. Some say she was visiting family. Some say she just wanted to see more than the dusty roads of Los Angeles. She sat in one of those wood-paneled Pullman cars, her gloved hands folded over a travel blanket, watching the blur of farmland and forest out the window. Next to her sat another woman, a stranger, alone but eager to talk. Train journeys back then were slow, days and nights of conversation, gossip, and the clatter of iron on rail. The two women talked about husbands, about children, about the wild promise of the West. Deida spoke of Los Angeles, how she and Harvey had left Kansas for sunshine and citrus groves, for a new start far from the grit and grit of the prairie towns. And then the stranger mentioned her own home, a little place near Chicago called Hollywood. Just a quiet, wooded suburb. Nothing famous. Not yet. But the name, it caught Deida's imagination like a spark on dry tinder. It tasted sweet in her mouth, soft, whimsical, dreamlike. Holly, the evergreen, the symbol of life in the dead of winter. Wood, strong, rooted, sheltering. A forest that never died, even when the world turned cold. By the time Deida stepped off that train days later, the name had already taken root in her mind. Some stories say she didn't sleep that night, that she sat by lamplight on the porch of their Los Angeles home, picturing the dusty hills they owned north of town. She saw something bigger than just plots and deeds. She saw a community, a place that might stand for something grander than oranges and moral sermons. Crickets chirping under warm California air, a distant coyote howl. When Harvey returned from Kansas, tired, dust-coated, papers in hand, Deida was waiting for him under the orange trees. They say she was smiling as she handed him a glass of cold water and an idea. "Harvey," she said, "let's call it Hollywood." If Harvey thought it strange, he didn't show it. The man who'd weathered polio and prairie winters, who counted fence posts and platted towns for a living, was not a man for poetry. But he trusted Deida, trusted her vision, her instinct for beauty in a place that was mostly dry brush and promise. So he did what he always did. He filed the paperwork. On February 1st, 1887, Harvey Henderson Wilcox filed the subdivision map for a new community north of the city, 120 acres divided into neat little lots. On the corner of that official document, he wrote a single word: Hollywood. No one could have guessed that name would become shorthand for dreams or nightmares, depending who you ask. Back then, it was just a marketing ploy, a pretty name for dusty land at the foot of the Cahuenga Pass. But Data and Harvey had big plans. They advertised Hollywood as a clean, moral community. No bars, no brothels, no gambling halls, just tidy cottages, sweet-smelling orchards, sunlit hills, and families who wanted a temperate Eden away from the whiskey-soaked sprawl of downtown Los Angeles. Harvey's vision was practical, rooted in his Methodist morals and Kansas sensibilities. He donated plots for churches, schools, libraries. He offered free lots to anyone who promised to build quickly, neighbors who'd share his dream of temperance and temperate living. Meanwhile, Data became the community's soul. If Harvey drew the map, Data colored it in. She hosted gatherings in their modest farmhouse, music, lectures, poetry readings under the glow of oil lamps. She courted artists, teachers, and settlers who believed in a fresh start under the California sun. In these early days, Hollywood was less a place than an idea. Pure, orderly, a little naive. Just a dusty village trying to keep the wildness of the city at arm's length. But the truth is, wildness always finds a way. By 1888, Harvey's subdivision had its first post office. The main road, then called Prospect Avenue, ran through groves and vacant lots. It would one day be Hollywood Boulevard, but back then it was a dusty trail for horse carts and the occasional carriage. There were no cameras yet, no producers, no scripts, no Klieg lights to pierce the dusk. Just small, hopeful houses and an orchard stretching up toward the hills. Harvey's dream was so simple it almost feels alien now. A village for good people, far from the city's sins. A place where a man's handshake meant more than a lawyer's letter, where a child could run through sun-dappled orchards and neighbors would tip their hats on the dusty lane. But the world had other plans, and just over the horizon, flickering silently in Nickelodeons and penny arcades, the future was getting ready to arrive. A future made of stories projected on white screens, of fantasies spun in celluloid and sold by the foot. And so the name took root, Hollywood, a word born on a train, scribbled on a map, whispered into life by a woman who dreamed bigger than the man who filed the deed. Harvey Henderson Wilcox planted the seed. But it was Data and a century of dreamers to follow who turned that name into a global idea. But before the cameras rolled, before the sign was hammered into the hillside, Harvey still had work to do. Streets to lay, churches to build, orchards to plant. He didn't know the spotlight was coming, didn't want it, wouldn't have welcomed it if he did. He just wanted good land, good neighbors, and a quiet place to grow old. But history, my friends, rarely does what we want. In Part 4, Hollywood's tidy streets meet a brand new magic, motion pictures, and Harvey Wilcox's Dreamtown town becomes something else entirely. Don't go anywhere. This is Faces of History, and we're just getting started. Before the billboards and the floodlights, before the movie moguls arrived with reels of celluloid dreams tucked under their arms, Hollywood was something else entirely. It was Harvey Henderson Wilcox's grand, quiet experiment, a place for good people to live clean, honest lives under the California sun. In 1887, when Harvey filed the Hollywood Tract, Los Angeles was still more promise than metropolis. Just a patchwork of dusty streets, Spanish adobe homes, horse carts creaking down rutted lanes. To the east, orange groves and vineyards. To the west, sun-baked hills rolling off into wild chaparral. If you'd ridden a wagon up Prospect Avenue, what we now call Hollywood Boulevard, you'd pass rows of pepper trees shading narrow dirt lanes, little cottages with picket fences, maybe a child playing marbles in the yard while chickens clucked in the dust. This was Harvey's dream made real. Not a boomtown, but a sanctuary. He platted his new community with meticulous care. Wide streets, generous lots, space for churches, schools, and libraries. He wanted orchards and flower gardens. He wanted whitewashed fences, not saloons. He named streets like Ivar, Gower, Vine, names that would later glow in neon, but back then they were just lines on a dusty grid, sprouting eucalyptus saplings and prayer meetings. The Wilcoxes worked side by side to breathe life into the dream. Harvey handled the deeds, the contracts, the endless shuffle of paper that turned dirt into dollars. Data opened their modest farmhouse to settlers, hosting teas, socials, music nights under the oil lamps. Their little home became Hollywood's first unofficial town hall. If Harvey was the backbone, firm, practical, Deida was the heart, the spark that made settlers believe in more than just land value. They offered free plots to churches, gave away land for a new schoolhouse, invited artists, writers, families from the Midwest, people like themselves who wanted sun and salvation far from the liquor dens of Los Angeles proper. Hollywood back then was a dry town by design. No saloons, no gambling halls, no brothels tucked behind false storefronts. Harvey Wilcox, the old Kansas prohibitionist, meant to keep it that way. But there was a tension humming under the orange blossoms, a tension that every dreamtown feels sooner or later. You can fence out sin on a map, but you can't fence out people. By the late 1880s, Los Angeles was growing teeth. The Southern Pacific and Santa Fe railroads were luring thousands west with cheap fares and cheaper land. Towns sprouted overnight. Some stayed dust, others bloomed. Harvey's Hollywood sat just far enough from downtown to feel like an escape, but close enough to attract speculators who smelled profit where Harvey saw purity. People came, Methodists, Quakers, farmers, teachers. They built neat cottages, planted flower beds, joined Deida's reading circles. Some were drawn by the climate, warm winters, gentle hills, sea breezes drifting over the Cahuenga Pass. Others came to escape the grime and vice of eastern cities. They liked the idea of a moral oasis, a town with no bar fights, no tavern brawls, no neon flicker to tempt young men off the straight path. In those early days, community was everything. Neighbors gathered for picnics under the pepper trees. Children chased fireflies through dusty orchards. On Sundays, families crowded into simple clapboard churches, voices rising in hymns that drifted through the citrus groves. But even then, Los Angeles was whispering bigger dreams. Downtown, real estate sharks and railroad barons carved up the basin. Water rights were being stolen and traded like poker chips. The oil fields to the south were waking up. Newspapers bragged that the sleepy Pueblo would one day rival San Francisco, a city of millions under perpetual sun. Up in the quiet hills of Hollywood, Harvey Wilcox tried to ignore the noise. He'd built what he came for, a moral community, a sober utopia with tree-lined streets and good neighbors. He hosted town meetings to keep liquor licenses away. He fought off attempts to run saloons through loopholes. He invested in roads and street lamps, small things that made people believe this dusty settlement could grow into something worthy. And for a while it did. Hollywood got its own post office. A tiny local paper, the Hollywood Sentinel, printed birth announcements and gossip about whose barn dance was best. A horse-drawn streetcar line was planned to run from Hollywood all the way down to the heart of Los Angeles. It would make commuting easier for the new breed of settlers. Middle-class dream wanted fresh air, but needed city jobs. By 1900, just over a decade after Harvey filed that fateful tract map, Hollywood had grown to around 500 souls. Still no movie cameras. Still no sign of the big lights to come, just dusty lots, gardens, and people who liked things simple. It was all so ordinary. And that's exactly how Harvey liked it. No one could have convinced him that one day this sleepy orchard town would become the epicenter of an industry built on dreams and illusions, on stories that flickered 24 frames a second across silver screens. If you'd stood with Harvey on a cool California evening, you'd see a man proud of what he'd built. You'd see him limping down Prospect Avenue beside Deida, tipping his hat to new neighbors planting flower beds where rattlesnakes once hid. You'd see a man who believed he'd given good people a safe place to call home, a place called Hollywood. But the world never stays simple, not when money and dreams collide. And as the 20th century crept closer, a brand new magic, motion pictures, was flickering to life thousands of miles away. Little did Harvey know that his orchard rows would soon host stagecoaches and cowboys, not real ones, but actors, that his dry town would become the playground for gin-soaked directors, starlets with secrets, moguls with marble mansions. But Harvey would never see that. His story, the quiet chapter, was almost over. In Part 5, we watch the man who named Hollywood fade into history, just as the world he couldn't imagine starts to take shape. Stick around, you won't want to miss it. Death before the dream. History has a cruel sense of humor. Sometimes it lets a man build the stage, but not stay long enough to see the curtain rise. By the early 1890s, Harvey Henderson Wilcox had done everything he set out to do. He'd taken a dry stretch of scrubland outside a sleepy frontier city and turned it into something real, a small, clean living community called Hollywood. The dusty trails were now quiet lanes. The orange groves hummed with bees. The cottages stood, painted and proper. Children walked to school on land he had donated. Neighbors greeted each other at church, at the post office, at Daida's famous little socials under the pepper trees. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't famous. But it was good, and for a man like Harvey, a boy shaped by polio and loss, that was enough. But even in paradise, shadows fall. In 1890, Harvey and Daida experienced the highest joy and the deepest sorrow. Their only child, Harry Wilcox, was born that year, a miracle for the aging father and his younger, radiant wife. For a time, the streets of Hollywood glowed a little brighter. Neighbors came by with cakes and blankets. Daida held the boy in the shade of their porch, singing old hymns and lullabies. Harvey, the man who built cities from blueprints, now built cradles and dreams. But the dream would not last. Just over a year later, in 1891, little Harry grew sick. Some say it was whooping cough, others say pneumonia. In those days, diagnoses were guesses, and medicine was mostly hope dressed in a bottle. Harvey watched, helpless, as the boy faded. Not even the golden California sun could warm the crib. And on a gray March morning, Harry Wilcox, Harvey's only child, passed away in his mother's arms. He was just 15 months old. The loss shattered something in Harvey. Friends would later say he was never the same. The man who had once limped down every street he'd drawn, clipboard in hand, now stayed inside. The plans he loved to draft sat unfinished on his desk. He no longer visited the orchards, no longer walked the lane. The town he'd planted kept growing, but he was no longer watching. On March 19, 1891, just weeks after burying his son, Harvey Henderson Wilcox died. The cause? Officially, it was listed as pneumonia, but those who knew him best said it wasn't his lungs that gave out, it was his heart. He was 58 years old, a husband, a father, briefly, a lawyer, a builder, a dreamer of simple dreams. He was laid to rest in Rosedale Cemetery in Los Angeles. No statue, no fanfare, just a modest headstone. The founder of Hollywood, buried not under lights, but under the quiet shade of cypress trees. And so Harvey passed, never knowing what would become of the land he had so carefully marked with streets and hopes. He never heard the word film reel, never saw a director's chair, never imagined the hills would one day echo with movie scores, that the cottages would be replaced by casting calls and neon signs. He died thinking Hollywood would remain what he intended, a sanctuary, a sober community for God-fearing folk. A temperate utopia with just enough dirt for every man to plant a future. But even before the last shovel of earth hit his casket, change was already coming. Just a few years later, in the final breaths of the 19th century, a new kind of magic was born on the opposite coast, in New York and New Jersey, then in Chicago, a magic made of gears and light. Motion pictures. Early Nickelodeons, tiny one-room theaters, charged a nickel to watch a few seconds of a boxing match, a train arriving at a station, a dancer spinning in a loop. Silent, flickering, mysterious. Then came the Great Migration, filmmakers fleeing the iron grip of Thomas Edison's patents, looking for a place where lawsuits couldn't find them and sunlight was free all year round. They needed cheap land, clear skies, open spaces. And in the early 1900s, they looked west, past the grime of downtown Los Angeles, and saw Harvey Wilcox's old dream waiting in the hills. By 1910, just 19 years after Harvey died, Hollywood was annexed into the city of Los Angeles. It had electricity, water, streetcars, and within just a few more years, it would have its first movie studio, then another, then another. The orchards came down. The cottages went up, bigger, flashier, gaudier. Churches gave way to film sets. Prayer meetings gave way to casting calls. The dry town was drowned in champagne, celluloid, and 1,000 burning ambitions. And the name that soft word Daida had once heard on a train, Hollywood, became the most powerful word in storytelling history. And Harvey, he missed it all. He died without fame, without wealth, without knowing that the land he'd sold for $150 an acre would one day be worth millions. He never saw his name on a marquee. He never walked past a theater showing a film with his name attached. He never even saw a motion picture. But every camera, every light, every desperate audition in a cramped element, they all owe something to the man who mapped out the streets that became the veins of the dream. A man who thought he was building heaven and accidentally built Hollywood. So what does it mean, in the end, to plant a seed you never live to see bloom? For Harvey Henderson Wilcox, the answer lies in every spotlight that sweeps across the California night sky. Every billboard, every movie palace, every silver screen that flickers to life in the dark. He died with no hint of what was coming. But his name, Hollywood, outlived him. And the one who made sure of that was the woman who first whispered it into existence. Dade Hartel Wilcox Beveridge. When Harvey was laid to rest under the quiet shade of Rosedale Cemetery, Dada was just 31. A widow, childless, standing in the orchard of a dream she and Harvey had built together. But Dada was not done. She could have gone back east. She could have sold the land, packed her bags, disappeared into polite society. But instead, she stayed right where the pepper trees swayed and doubled down. They called her the Mother of Hollywood, and for good reason. It was Dada who continued to shape the neighborhood after Harvey's death, giving land for churches, libraries, and civic buildings. She hosted community gatherings, organized women's clubs, and made sure the dream of a clean living suburb outshone the city's sprawl, at least for a little while longer. When the motion picture men came sniffing around, they didn't find Harvey's strict handshake. They found Dada's open door. In 1911, just 20 years after Harvey's funeral, the first motion picture studio opened in Hollywood, a single tin-roofed barn on Sunset Boulevard. The old orchard fences gave way to painted backdrops. The dusty orange groves turned into stage sets for westerns and slapstick comedies. Cowboys who once roamed the hills were replaced by stuntmen and extras in fake spurs. Dada, the last guardian of Harvey's vision, didn't fight it. Instead, she embraced it. She believed, perhaps, that this new magic, the moving picture, was just another kind of moral tale, another way to gather good people under one name. By the 1920s, Hollywood was no longer just a town. It was an idea, a global beacon for storytellers, dreamers, schemers, and the occasional saint or sinner hoping to carve their name in lights. Imagine Harvey, if he could have seen it. The man who once limped through Kansas boom towns with deeds in his pocket would have stood on Sunset Boulevard watching a fleet of cars jam the street in front of Grauman's Chinese Theater. Girls in silk dresses, men in tuxedos, flashbulbs popping like fireworks. He would have stared up at that famous white sign on the hillside, Hollywoodland, originally a real estate gimmick to sell housing lots along the hills. He would have watched as letter by letter, the name he and Dada borrowed on a train ride became bigger than either of them could have dreamed. He never saw Mary Pickford's curls or Charlie Chaplin's mustache. He never heard the word talkie. He never saw the Technicolor rainbows of The Wizard of Oz or the starlit heartbreak of Casablanca. He never saw the scandals, the studio wars, the broken contracts, the billion-dollar franchises, the dreams that soared, and the souls that burned out in cheap motels under the same sign. But every frame, every scene, every credit roll owes him something, because without the land, there is no lot. Without the map, there is no boulevard. Without that single word scribbled on a piece of parchment, Hollywood, there is no dream factory at all. By the time Dada passed away in 1914, the dream had outgrown even her. She died seeing the studios take root, the cameras arrive, the actors and set carpenters and union men pouring in by the hundreds. She saw the orchards vanish under backlots and bungalows. She saw the town's temperance dreams drown in champagne and studio parties that ran till dawn. And still, she never tried to stop it. Maybe she knew, better than Harvey ever could, that stories are stubborn. They grow where they will. They tangle through fences. They break through concrete. Hollywood was no longer about dry town squares and Sunday picnics. It was about stories big enough to travel the world. Today, the sign on the hill is just 9 letters, towering over Los Angeles like a promise and a dare. It's been rebuilt, vandalized, repainted, saved from ruin by rock stars and preservationists alike. But it's more than wood and metal. It's a beacon for anyone who's ever dreamed of seeing their name in lights. And somewhere deep in that glow is Harvey, the quiet Ohio farm boy who dragged one leg behind the other but never let the world drag him down. The Kansas lawyer who mapped out dusty tracks in a boomtown no one believed would matter. The accidental father of a myth. Hollywood is stars on the Walk of Fame. It's cramped writers' rooms, it's stage mothers, it's cameras rolling at dawn. It's a broken promise and an impossible dream at the same time. And it's all built on the bones of Harvey's orchard rows, the dusty paths he carved out under the California sun, never knowing his name would travel the world. So next time you stand on Hollywood Boulevard, next time you crane your neck to see the sign through the haze, next time you watch the credits roll at the end of a movie that makes you laugh or cry or feel a little braver than you did before, remember Harvey Henderson Wilcox, the man who didn't make the movies, but gave them the world's biggest stage. That's his legacy. The orchard turned dreamscape, the name that slipped from a stranger's lips on a passing train and found a home in the hills. A legacy built not in searchlights, but in silence, a story the movies could never improve. I'm the Duke of New York, and this was Faces of History. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, the biggest stars often stand on the shoulders of the ones you never see.